President Cyril Ramaphosa says government is considering declaring a national state of disaster in response to the country's energy crisis. And that's as South Africa continues to grapple with the worst bout of load shedding on record. Ramaphosa says a state of disaster will allow government to urgently address the energy crisis, which has cost, as we know, the country billions of rand. Let's unpack the story. We're joined this morning by Casac's Executive Director. Lawson Naidoo joins us via our video link this morning. Lawson, great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on to the program this Wednesday. It's sad, isn't it, that our first response to government and its support for declaring a state of disaster is one of suspicion.
Good morning, Michelle. Thank you very much. Indeed it is, and indeed it should be. Because we've had a very recent experience with the state of national disaster being declared due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And whilst, that was certainly necessary in the circumstances, it was a global pandemic, and countries across the world were scrambling to try to deal with the human toll that pandemic inflicted upon all of us. But we know from our own experience that some of the measures that were taken by government were extremely harsh, curtailed our civil liberties and human rights. And was not based on the best scientific advice available always. Whilst government succeeded in defending many of the cases that were brought against them during the pandemic for, overzealous use of the disaster management regulations, there were instances where government was found wanting. And I think it's that sense of recent memory that leads us to be somewhat cynical about this, but especially in the context that, the Disaster Management Act is there primarily for natural disasters. Now, the Act does make provision for, human engineered disasters, which one could argue the power crisis in South Africa is. It's something we have lived with for 15 years now. And why only now does the government deem it necessary, if indeed it does, that a national state of disaster is required to deal with this crisis? We've had numerous interventions over the years, and there's no indication as to why the current legal and regulatory framework is not sufficient to be able to deal with load shedding.
It's this deviation from procurement processes, Lawson, that perhaps is the most worrying thing about declaring a state of disaster. I mean, in your opinion, how, if we did this, if we went ahead with declaring a state of disaster, insofar as the energy crisis is concerned, how do we ensure that it's not for the purposes of looting?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to do, and we need to make sure, is firstly, one looks carefully at what the President said in his closing address to the ANC Lekgotla on Monday evening, is that government is still seeking to determine whether the conditions exist for a state of national disaster to be declared. And I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to do that. And secondly, he also said that they also need to determine what additional powers they might require under such a national state of disaster to actually enable them to deal with the energy crisis. So those are not clear. And, there have been a number of interventions over the years and in recent times. In the middle of last year, the President established a crisis committee to deal with the issue of load shedding. In December last year, we had the South African National Defence Force deployed to take care of national key points, which includes power stations as a result of allegations of sabotage on our power lines. So there are a number of interventions that have already been made, and it seems that it's a question really of having more effective government, the political will to deal with the crisis, and a coherent policy emanating from government, because we hear different people from the President and others in the presidency, on the one hand talking about the urgency of dealing with it, and then we hear from Minister Mantashe, who seems, somewhat reluctant to proceed, in particular with signing deals with the independent power producers and the like, and ensuring that renewable resources are brought onto the grid as soon as is practicable. We must also bear in mind that we have a budget coming up in about 3 weeks' time, and this will enable the Minister of Finance to provide the kind of funding that would be required in order to deal with some of these interventions that are indeed necessary.
Yeah, so the Crisis Committee, the deployment of the army insofar as protecting Eskom's infrastructure, there's the Eskom war room, and the list goes on and on. We've tried, I suppose, on paper to deal with the energy crisis, right? Is the support now of declaring a state of disaster an admission by the ANC-led government then that they failed?
Well, I think one can't read it any other way. That it's been a failure of policy implementation. It's been a failure of political will to deal with the crisis. And I'm not sure that the declaration of a national state of disaster is going to fundamentally alter those factors. What we need is a clear intent from government to have an implementation plan on the table in terms of increasing the capacity of our current power plants, bringing on stream as soon as possible other forms of energy, including renewables, to boost the capacity of the grid. These are not going to happen overnight, as we well know. We've been told variously that, load shedding will be dealt with by the end of this year or may take 2 years. So, the other issue that arises is how long a national state of disaster will be required in order to eliminate load shedding and to get a stable power supply back for the country and for the economic prosperity of the country, and to alleviate the impact that it's having on ordinary households, on small businesses and the like.
One newspaper this morning is describing the declaration of a state of disaster like putting out a fire with petrol, Lawson. Given all of the statements that have been made by the ANC president, by Secretary General Fikile Mbalula, around declaring the state of disaster, around ending load shedding by the end of the year. I mean, the ANC is very clearly on the campaign trail, right? Because this energy crisis will play a big role in how it fares at the polls next year.
Indeed. I mean, this does smack a little bit of a populist move to try and demonstrate to the South African public that government is taking the crisis seriously and is trying to do something about it. But in the absence of a clear statement from government as to why a national state of disaster is required, exactly what measures are going to be implemented in order to alleviate the crisis, as well as, I think, Michelle, very importantly, what is going to be the role of Parliament in overseeing all of this? Obviously during the COVID-19 pandemic, which struck us, without notice, Parliament was unable to sit immediately because of the restrictions that were in place at the time, and they took some time to get the virtual meetings up and running. There's no such excuse this time. Parliament is going to be in session within the next week, and Parliament needs to play a critical role in terms of approving any such national state of disaster, the parameters of such a state of disaster, and to exercise continuous oversight over government's implementation of any regulations under that regime. And that includes, as you raised earlier, very importantly, the issue of procurement, and in particular, the kinds of emergency procurement that have been discussed, and specifically I'm referring to the car power ships deal that is seemingly still on the table, and to ensure that there is in fact compliance with the constitutional provisions of free and open processes and a cost-effective solution to the crisis.
Absolutely. Oversight and Parliament will be another big theme. We know what the State Capture Inquiry had to say about Parliament's failure in that regard. Lawson Naidoo, let me thank you for your time this morning. He is an Executive Director with the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, as we continue to unpack these calls for a state of disaster insofar as the energy crisis is concerned.